It's a real pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sherman Silber. Sherman Silber is a renowned pioneer in microsurgery and infertility, is considered one of the world's leading authority on IVF, mini IVF, sperm retrieval, ICSI, vasectomy reversal, male infertility, tubal ligation reversal, egg and embryo freezing, and ovary transplantation, and the reproductive biology clock. For over 38 years, Dr. Silber has originally developed all of the most popular fertility treatments using all around the world today. For this meeting, I asked Dr. Silber to discuss with us a topic, mini IVF.
Well, hi, I'm Dr. Silber. I know all of you very, very well. We've been around for a long time, and I'd like to talk about mini IVF to our IVF Worldwide meeting here, October 2021. This is a controversial subject. Obviously, drug reps are not excited about it, and many infertility centers are not happy about it, and partly because it's kind of tricky to do, and it contradicts a basic intuition that women that have less eggs and are older should have more hormonal stimulation to try to get more eggs, which absolutely doesn't work, and it's counterproductive. And I'll explain all that. I'll give you the science of it, and I'll give you the data. Now, first, just look, this is just a photograph of a typical notebook at a time of an ultrasound of a patient having a good response. And we actually delineate every follicle with its size and the day of stimulation. And it's just a shot from our notebooks. And you can see from this and any other time you do a stimulation with a lot of eggs that you can't possibly expect all these eggs to be good. It's impossible to have an even cohort of good eggs. There are only going to be a small number of these eggs that are going to be able to result in a baby. Let's go further. First, let's go with a paper that I did with Dr. Kato and colleagues in Japan. And we did the analysis of it here and at MIT with Helen Skoletsky. Intrinsic fertility of the human oocytes, which we published in Fertility and Sterility in 2017. So we wanted to know what the intrinsic fecundity rate of a human egg was in relation to age with no hyperstimulation, because hyperstimulation has been found to yield a live baby rate per egg. It's in the literature. It's the Cobo data and the Patrizio data and many others of 4 to 6% baby rate per egg, which is pretty low, we thought. So on average, in a standard hyperstimulation cycle, even in a young woman, 20 to 25 eggs would be required to produce a single live baby, but that's in stimulated cycles. The live baby rate per egg in natural cycle, single embryo transfer, IVF, would estimate better the intrinsic fertility of the human oocyte. And we did this in 14,000 natural cycle single embryo transfers. So it's dense data, and the MIT statisticians were amazed at just how reliable it is when we have this much data. And I'll show you the graph, but the primary outcome, of course, we care about is not just the baby rate per transfer, the baby rate per cycle, but really what is the baby rate per oocyte? What's the intrinsic fertility of the oocyte? For if you took the whole group of women under 42 years of age or equal to 42, I mean, this is a gigantic age range. I'll go over the details later, but the overall live baby rate per oocyte is 18% with no stimulation, which means that only 5.5 oocytes are needed to produce one baby, not the 25 oocytes needed to produce one baby with stimulated cycles. And this is just a table from the paper. And if you look on the far right-hand side and can read that, I think I'll put on my glasses so that I can make sure I read it right also. But you can see that for women under 35, there's a 26% live baby rate for single egg. I mean, she only needs 4 eggs to have a baby. And that is so different than needing 25 eggs. as is the case with hyperstimulated cycles. And then it's very good data that goes down over the age of the patient. You can see the numbers are gigantic, adding up to over 14,000 oocytes. And when you finally are at age 42, there is 4% baby rate per oocyte. And that's pretty old. But let's say you wound up over the course of 2 or 3 cycles getting 10 oocytes. Well, with no stimulation, you should have a 40% baby rate in a 42-year-old woman. So that's pretty amazing. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button here. Now, that's the graph, and it's remarkably good close curve. You can see the formula in the upper right-hand side, and they were just amazed at MIT that you could have such a tight correlation, and that's because we just had so many of these cases. So you can see that the baby rate per egg begins to go down somewhat up until 35, and then at the age of 35, it just goes down very, very rapidly. And now compare this to the curve on the top, and then in the bottom is the standard baby rates per egg published by Cobo and Patrizio and Lemon. These are in the literature, the index baby rates per egg. Most people don't publish baby rate per egg, but the few that do come up with answers that are pretty much the same. And at almost any given age, the baby rate per egg with no stimulation is 3 to 5 times higher than the baby rate with hyperstimulation. It's dramatic. The data is overwhelming because we have so many numbers. Now, this is the protocol we're going to be recommending, and it seems strange. It was the original Cato protocol with some modifications. First, you put the patient on birth control pills. And when you understand the data coming from Hayashi and in vitro gametogenesis, you'll understand how important birth control pills are to suppress the ovary in order to get the best quality eggs, because you only want the eggs that have just recently finished what we call IVG or IVD and are ready to be stimulated, because if you catch eggs that are older than that, then you're not going to be best quality. So you must suppress with birth control pills first. And then after 5 days, it's going to be day 3 of the cycle and day 1 of stimulation with just Clomid, 50 milligrams a day. And you can add to that as just a mild booster on day 3, FSH or Follistim or Gonalef, 150 IU every other day. Since the half-life is almost 2 days, there's no point in giving it every day. And so you keep them on the Clomid until the time of the trigger. And the reason are twofold. One is you keep the stimulation going, very mild, but also Clomid as an anti-estrogen helps to prevent a premature LH surge, because as the estrogen goes up, the pituitary doesn't realize it's going up so fast. And so that's a beautiful natural way of preventing a premature ovulation. And we add a little Indocin as an anti-inflammatory to just give us a few more hours just to make sure we don't get premature ovulation. And we don't get premature ovulation. It would be very, very rare using this protocol. So there was an editorial about this issue that I'll just share with you from last year from Gita Nargund and Bart Fauser, and they've always been advocates of mild stimulation. And in that editorial, they pointed out that a high oocyte yield reflects primarily an adequate ovarian reserve and not the stimulation protocol. It's more than the stimulation protocol or the dose used is the actual intrinsic ovarian reserve of the patient. So a high response to ovarian stimulation simply represents good prognosis patients, but only if it's with low dose of stimulation. So let me show you this. Surprisingly, many eggs can be obtained with Mini IVF with just this tiny little stimulation I mentioned in young women with normal ovarian reserve. Now here's a woman with just 50 milligrams of Clomid. That's all she had. And we see many cases like this. If they're young women with a good ovarian reserve, you're not settling for 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 oocytes. You can get 20 oocytes from these patients. And they're great oocytes because they weren't caused by overstimulation. So why Mini IVF? Well, so many cross-sectional studies now, Baker et al. Being the most prominent in 2015, have revealed an inverse relationship between the gonadotropin dosage and live birth rates. Now, okay, you're going to say, well, sure, because they needed less gonadotropin. No, if you do a multivariate analysis And you will find out that whether it's a lot of eggs or a few eggs, whether it's an old woman or a young woman, whatever group you want to break it up into, the lower the dose of gonadotropin, the higher the baby rate per cycle. So the relationship of FSH, these are the four major themes. The relationship of FSH and LH dose to the live baby rate will explain the science and also what we have learned that helps us from in vitro gametogenesis studies by Hayashi. And then the fertility per egg in natural and clonate cycles will be discussed. And then we'll discuss the epigenetic disruption that occurs from hyperstimulation, and we'll compare the results of minimal stimulation to COH. So first, let's talk about something that maybe most of you don't think about, the fertile unit syndrome. This is something that male infertility people should know about. This is a rare situation, a male with genetically absent LH who has normal FSH. We call it the fertile eunuch. Because they're a eunuch, they don't make any testosterone. Yet because of normal FSH, they make sperm, but they make a very low amount of sperm. All they have is FSH, no LH. So it's poor to low motility. So the fertile eunuch is just a joking term for him, since he really is not fertile, but he is making sperm because he does make FSH. Now, give him a modest dose of HCG or LH, and his sperm count suddenly rises to over 100 million per cc with great motility. The same relationship of FSH to LH is seen in the woman with ovarian stimulation and egg quality. So what are the relative roles of FSH and LH? I want to make sure I keep to my time. Sorry. What are the relative roles? Well, you want to have an equal but modest elevation of FSH and LH at the very beginning of recruitment. And I got a tremendous lesson from Robert Fisher that LH is not HCG. You want endogenous LH, and we can't give LH exogenously. We don't have it in the US. And if you did, it would be very difficult to administer because the half-life is so short. So you want that modest LH increase and an equally modest FSH increase. And you don't want any artificial lowering of LH to avoid premature ovulation because you need that LH for egg quality. So number 4, you see FSH recruits oocyte numbers. No question about that. Necessary, but only in modest amount. LH improves oocyte quality. High doses of FSH just recruit more poor follicles and creates hyperstimulation. And when I give my talk about the journey of the sperm, you're going to understand this a lot better. So what have we learned from in vitro gametogenesis? We have a very close collegial relationship with Katsuhiko Hayashi in Kyushu, Japan. What have we learned from that? Well, there we are. This is my joking picture of the two of us collaborating together in Kyushu, Japan. And he's so tall and I'm so short. So I'm referred to in Kyushu as the Y chromosome, and he's referred to as the X chromosome, just for humor. So in his model, we have 3 stages of oocyte development: IVD, IVG, IVM, and I'll explain them. And those stages are really the same for in vitro oogenesis, which could be analyzed very well, and in vivo oogenesis, which is more difficult to analyze. And we'll explain the application of that to IVM and also to Mini IVF. And this talk is about the Mini IVF application. So this is just a very complicated but beautiful graphic summary of making mature and normal eggs that result in healthy baby mice simply from PGCs that are derived from stem cells, and they can be iPS cells just derived from the mouse's skin biopsy. And look carefully and you see there are 3 phases of differentiation. There's that 21 days when the oogonia are actually exposed to no hormones necessary. It's just natural stimulation surrounded by granulosa cells. The granulosa cells make all the genes that are necessary to allow those oogonia, once they're recruited from primordial follicles. And we don't have to deal with primordial follicles when we have just in vitro gametogenesis. So we don't have to unlock the oogonia. The oogonia come from the PGCLCs automatically, and there's no unlocking necessary. So there's 21 days of exposures to granulosa cells. That is the in vitro differentiation, or the IVD phase. And then they're ready for IVG. That is the stage where suddenly in vivo, they would be antral follicles, or pre-antral follicles that are going to be sensitive to gonadotropin. And amazingly, the mouse is very similar to the human on this. I mean, the human would take 4 months for IVD, but for IVG, the human and the mouse are similar, and they take just 11 to 14 days. And then all you need is 1 day for IVM, which is exposure to HCG in vitro, or LH if you have that. Either one would work. Those are the 3 stages of development of the oocyte. And you must understand that you're only going to get good oocytes if you start stimulating them in the IVG stage right after they've finished IVD, because otherwise they'll be in the stage of decline. You have to time it exactly right. And with in vitro oogenesis, of course, we don't have to worry about a locked primordial follicle. The IVD stage, you can see there, just occurs automatically from the PGCs. And once you get to the IVG phase, that's a 10 to 15 day process. And after that, the eggs are all ready to be matured. It's very simple. They don't need anything special. Okay, so during the first 3 weeks of culture in fetal granulosa cells, which is 4.5 months in the human, this is IVD, so no FSH is there. Then culture the open follicles 11 days with FSH, which is IVG. Maybe you should LH as well. I'm not sure Hayashi has as efficient as a result as he would if he added LH as well during his IVG phase. And then just use a normal in vivo concentration of FSH and LH for in vitro oogenesis. But we're not talking about that in this talk. We're just talking about why Mini IVF works. In vivo, once oocytes have completed IVG, they are meiotically competent, ready for HCG, and it's a constant daily process. At any time, a certain number of oocytes in the in vivo ovary have completed IVG, and they are ready for IVM. So going to this slide, and I'll go more quickly, mature GVs that have finished IVG and are not ovulated or matured by IVM or fertilized gradually deteriorate. So it is not reasonable to expect that all these GVs are equally ready and competent time-wise. GVs that are overripe cannot be expected to produce fertile oocytes. The only reason in nature for the ovulatory cycle, as well as IVF stimulation, is to get the egg out of the ovary. You don't need all that FSH to develop the eggs. All you need that for is to get them out of the ovary. So this is the paper by Baker et al., which is a very famous paper that showed if you broke it down by FSH dose for the number of oocytes retrieved and the total dose of the gonadotropin, you find as you go down that the higher the dose of the gonadotropin, the lower is the baby rate, live birth rate per cycle. Looking at it a different way, basing it on the number of oocytes retrieved and the dose, you can see at any given number of oocytes retrieved, the lower the dose, the higher the success rate. And then what about stratified by both the number of oocytes and the age? And again, if you stratify by age and number of oocytes, still, no matter how you look at it, the lower the dose of FSH, the higher the baby rate per cycle. And the Duke study that just came out last year verifies this also from 8,627 cycles from ASRM. And by increasing the follicle stimulating dose, adversely affects the live birth rate in autologous cycles. But they wanted to see, would it do that in donor cycles? Because, for example, you could always say that the high dose rate is affecting the uterine lining, and that's the reason for the lower results with higher FSH dosage. So they wanted to put an experiment in where endometrial receptivity is not an issue. So these were all fresh donor cycles, 8,627. And again, in donor cycles where receptivity is not an issue, there was a negative association of total FSH dosage on fresh IVF live births performed in the donor population to control for oocyte source and endometrial receptivity. Logistic regression models, multivariate odds ratios showed that this was absolutely the case in any situation. Implantation rate, was also figured, and the implantation weight showed a negative association with total FSH dose and clinical pregnancy and baby rate for donor egg cycles. So the total FSH dose is negatively associated with the odds of a live birth, and consistent with Baker et al. That showed the same in 658,000 cycles, but they weren't donor cycles. So apart from cost and safety issues, overstimulation of the donor can affect the live birth rate, and it's not due to endometrial receptivity. So they postulated, and I believe they were correct from the Duke study, that the problem is epigenetic alterations and that are otherwise undetectable changes in oocyte competency. So the index papers of Patrizio and Cobo, as I said before, showed a intrinsic fertility of human oocytes of about 5 to 6%. So with no stimulation and single embryo transfer, the live baby rate is 26%. So it's a 4 to 5-fold increase in baby rate per oocyte with no stimulation compared to COH. So this is a slide from Patrizio's paper, which was spectacular and first alerted us all to the extremely high wastage rate of oocytes in hyperstimulated cycles. And this is a summary based on age. You can see that it's consistent. The live baby rate for oocytes starts out with donors at 4.7. By the time you're 41 or 42, it's 0.9%. And Cobo found the same thing really in looking at her frozen oocytes. The oocyte to baby rate was 6.5%. And this is her graph showing that. So now what about with Mini IVF, even with just Clomid? How does that compare? Well, you can see again, Cobo showed a baby rate of 6.5% down to 1.8% per egg. And Patrizio showed 7.7% down to 2.9%. But look at what we have from the paper Vabi et al. In 2019 with our protocol. With women under 34 equal, 24% baby rate per egg, 35 to 37 years of age, 15.3%. At any stage, it's 4 times higher baby rate per egg, which is extremely important in older women. So for women less than 42, if you average them, gamish them all together, it was 18%, which means only 5.5 oocytes need to produce one baby, not 25 oocytes. Now look at this graph. You can see our original graph from natural cycle, and then you see in the red lines the graph that is for Mini IVF. The advantage of Mini IVF being that it's much easier to manage that kind of a cycle than a natural cycle, and we get more eggs. And then compare that to the lines below, and those would be the index papers by Cobo, Patrizio, and Lemon, and see that at any age, it's 3 to 5 times higher baby rate per egg than with controlled ovarian hyperstimulation. And you can see even baby rate per cycle. Oh my gosh, for equal or less than 34 years, with this hardly any stimulation, you have a 54% pregnancy rate and a 47% live baby rate just per cycle. And then look at our St. Louis experience. Our pregnancy rate per transfer is 63%, and our live birth rate per transfer is 50.2%, with just minimal stimulation. And we may only get in older women 2 or 3 eggs, but in younger women, we often get a lot of eggs with this minor stimulation. And even in women over 43 years old, we have a 12.3% baby rate per transfer. And so what if we have enough for 3 transfers? We can get as high as a 40% baby rate using Mini IVF for older women, where normally you'd expect maybe a 5% success rate. So high age-related cumulative baby rates are achievable in women of all ages who undergo Mini IVF using Clomid Mini IVF for stimulation. The baby rate per egg is 3 to 5 times higher at any given age than with high-dose gonadotropin cycles. And well, I may be close to running out of my time, but we have found that the reason for this, we know that we need LH for egg quality, and FSH shouldn't be too high to avoid epigenetic perturbation. Now, we know the entire development of any organism is determined obviously by epigenetics. The genes are turned on and off, expressed and repressed, and at any given moment in a rapidly changing embryo, and it's simply an epigenetic phenomenon. DeWall and McCary, studying this detailed in the early embryo development of the mouse, found imprinting embryos only resulted from higher gonadotropin dosage. Lower gonadotropin gave no imprinting errors and no epigenetic perturbation. So gonadotropin stimulation contributes to the induction of epimutations in mouse IRT, and we don't know, but we suspect it's also true with the human. What is DNA methylation all about? Well, I don't think I have time to go into this, but I'll just show you this quick diagram, and we can go over it in more detail at some other time. But we go through two phases of DNA methylation because you really have to turn those germ cells into differentiated cells in order for them to make the baby. And the very first few days of the embryo's life, the first week of the embryo's life, is dependent on extremely rapid changes in methylation patterns. And these patterns, I'll give you one quick slide, are genes that are conserved regulators of early development of the embryo. And that's true in all the mammals that we've studied, and even in the opossum, which isn't exactly a mammal. And so there are just 405 genes, that's all there is, that are conserved well, and therefore are the ones that are related to the earliest embryo development. And those genes are affected by poised patterns on and off, which I can explain in another talk. And so we think that it's important not to overstimulate and to recognize, as Bob Fisher did, the importance of early LH for egg quality. Thank you very much for allowing me to give this talk.
Thank you very much, Sherman, for a very exciting and stimulating lecture on mini IVF. I have a few questions for you, and because we have some shortage of time, if you can give me some short answer for the lectures. You mentioned in your talk that you stimulate for mini IVF with Clomid. Can you a little bit elaborate more on the protocol? How do you give the Clomid, for how long?
Well, the Clomid actually is a way to get endogenous LH elevated. And I borrowed this idea from Robert Fisher that LH is better than HCG for the early quality of the egg. And we, at least in America, can't give LH exogenously, and it's actually metabolized so quickly that it really wouldn't be very useful, but we can get endogenous LH elevation with Clomid. So Clomid winds up giving us extraordinarily good quality eggs. We know that, but it's a low pregnancy rate if it's just given in a standard way without mini IVF because of the negative effect on the uterine lining. But as the estrogen goes up, because Clomid is developing follicles, we don't want the FSH to start coming down, which it will. So we give 150 of either folliestim or gonal-F every other day, just to keep that FSH from coming down. So we get a mild elevation of FSH, and we also get the mild elevation of LH, which is responsible for egg quality early on. And we keep them on the Clomid until it's time to actually aspirate the egg, because the idea of stopping it at 5 days was just introduced decades ago because you'd hope the effect of the uterine lining could be ameliorated, but that doesn't really work anyway. But if you keep them on Clomid the whole time, as an anti-estrogen, it prevents premature ovulation. And so you really don't have to be putting patients on big doses of ganirelix to prevent that, because keeping them on Clomid prevents that. Plus, it keeps the FSH from dropping down as the follicles are growing. So that would be our protocol, at least for older women or women with low ovarian reserve.
We all know, Sherman, that in some cycles, while you treat patients with Clomid, we have difficulties with the development of the endometrium. So do you freeze all in these cycles, or do you replace embryo?
Yeah, that's a good question. We feel it's safer just to freeze them all, because you can't really tell. Sometimes the uterine lining and the triple layer looks fine, but there's still a negative impact from the anti-estrogen effect. And so the whole idea of mini IVF is making Clomid a much more powerful drug than you'd ever have imagined, because we freeze those embryos and then we transfer them 3 months later after the uterine lining we know has recovered from the Clomid.
Thank you, Sherman. You mentioned in your presentation that you are using mini dose of gonadotrophin. We all know that the ovary has a threshold for gonadotrophin. So how do you determine threshold? Because different women needs different doses of FSH.
Well, that's quite correct. And this threshold phenomenon is very important, because from young women with a high ovarian reserve, surprisingly, with this mini IVF, we can get many eggs, 20 eggs from a little Clomid and a little FSH. So it can be unpredictable. The way we do it, and it seems to be working just great, is for older women or women with low ovarian reserve, we just give them the standard Clomid and the FSH 150 IU every other day. But for women who have a better ovarian reserve or younger women, we'll go to 100 of FSH every day. We still don't get a huge elevation of FSH, and occasionally we'll go to 225. And the whole idea is if you can get a decent number of eggs, the most that you get from that patient, by giving the least amount of gonadotropin and making sure you have that LH in the early part of their cycle, our data that's published is that the baby rate per egg is 4 to 5 times higher than with massive ovarian stimulation, exceeding that. Most cycles tend to exceed that threshold by huge amounts. And as they do that, they get a lower baby rate per egg.
You showed a very nice pregnancy rate in your unit. So if this is being supported by this protocol, I think you deserve congratulations. It's very nice. And I want to thank you again for sharing this information with us and being with us today. And I'm sure that the participants will benefit from listening to your presentation. So thank you again, Sherman.
Thank you very much, Zev. I love this meeting because I love hearing what everybody says. And I hear the most original comments that are very important to us from all over the world when I attend this meeting. Thank you.